So we had a look at the RROs, the regulatory reform orders. As you may know, when we started about 4 or 5 years ago, only about 46% of local authorities had a regulatory reform order. Most of them were long in the tooth and were written in 2003. Since then, that figure has risen to about 96% of local authorities who now have an RRO. And the work that Yasmin has been doing for us, and I can't claim any of this for my own, it's all Yasmin's work. She's actually ragged through all 293 published RROs across England and looked at a variety of services available through those housing assistance policies. My huge surprise was that actually 181 out of 293, that is 62% of all housing assistance policies, make reference to move on, to assist people to move on. And that was an enormous surprise to me, because I never see anything happening as it is. There's clearly something that people make sure that is in policy, but then seem not to use. And that is quite surprising. When we looked under the bonnet of all the ones that mentioned it, there was a mean relocation assistance of, so that's the average grant that was available through local authorities, of about £13,000, which is a considerable sum. That would go a long way to pay for the removal cost, I wager, Kevin, if the application process was reasonably slick, and probably still buy you some carpets in the new property. The mode, that is the average, that's the sort of most common grant available, was about 10 grand. It's still quite generous, and then there was an enormous range with some very generous providers out there in some local authorities. As is with all these policies, they're all named differently. Some of them are grants, some of them are loans. It's probably not that interesting to see. So there was an expectation by some local authorities that these things would be paid back. I find that difficult to see and how that would work, but there was clearly an expectation. So because I was really surprised that over 60% of local authorities had these policies written in their policies, and could, in theory, then help people like Kevin out and his clients out to help them move. I just asked Yasmin to check, and we only started doing this about 2 or 3 weeks ago, so we've only had a chance to talk about 5 or 6 local authorities, and we've listed them there. They'll be really helpful in opening up about what doesn't work for them. So, like all move-on conversations, there's a lot of not controversy, but difficulty about actually broaching the subjects. One of the things that all local authorities we've spoken to is that there hardly any are done, and often they find that the adaptations that are on offer, or the repairs that are on offer, are enough for people to settle back into their home, and that may well be true. But of course, what struck me about this is that this is the same team whose raison d'etre, whose only purpose for being, is actually doing the adaptation. So not surprisingly, they'll default back to adaptations where that's possibly can, and might not make the right or fully informed information available to the people facing an inappropriate home. One of the things that struck me, and Kevin mentioned it, was that EAC does a very good job of showing what is available in terms of care homes locally, and actually what is beholden onto people like Michael is that he then has to know in his mind where the properties are that people can move to, because it is clearly really difficult for local authorities to maintain a register of appropriate properties that people might want to move to at some point. In fact, for many local authorities who had a grant scheme on the books, they said, well, we go through an enormous amount of work, we get the client all ready, and then find that there's actually can't find any appropriate policies, housing in the area that they are. So there's clearly a job on in terms of matching people to housing and housing to people, because at the moment that is not a job that's being done. So there were some really positive noises, though. So for those that do move, they are very often people for whom this transforms their lives, and I think that Michael's video shows that, how from being locked into a home where you can't get in and out of, or you're completely isolated, they end up in a place which is both socially and spatially and in terms of personal attachment much more appropriate and fun to live in. We all know the other reason why we should do better is that we all know, and it might not be 28% of the houses that are unadaptable. We do know that people, not all, there is a really hard kernel of people who do have to move, who have no choice but to move. Now, I think that the earlier and the more involved we have, we can make people engage with the choices that they have, the easier that move can be made, can be done. And then lastly, local authority said that actually, where they do successfully move, some of those moves save an awful lot of money, not just in the cost of adaptations, which sometimes can be huge in the case of families or some older people, but even in the but also in the cost of onward care. I was really struck by Lou's description, the fact that actually didn't need a carer to shower anymore, because actually she was now in a place where she could do this perfectly by herself. So saving both on dignity and care, I think. Really raises a lot of issues. One of the things that local authorities said, where they used their own people to deliver these services, was that it was such fun to do. It allowed for an awful lot of creativity. There were so many different jobs that the move-on workers would need to be able to turn their hand to support people through that process. And that was everything from hiring vans and solicitors' fees to negotiating with estate agents, as well as looking at appropriate adaptations in the new properties. And for all of those who've asked the question whether you could both do a move-on grant and a DFG, yes, that is perfectly possible, and of course it makes sense. One of the difficulties that people had was in terms of proving the impact, and I was really struck by Kevin's example of that, was actually we monitor these inputs through our normal grant monitoring systems, and they're not particularly good at actually teasing out what we actually achieve, particularly not in aborted services. Of course, if nobody moved, is that a failure? Or does that mean that people have made choices, informed choices, and actually are now safer in the home that they were in the first place, and actually have a way through in the future of getting out? So it was really hard to actually say, well, actually, once people are in the system of a move-on system, you have to look at different outcomes to say to people, this too is a success. And it was really clear that the sort of monitoring systems that get people through the tender period and the application and blah, 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 and then the build, and it costs so much money to build, was not really appropriate in terms of reporting the outcomes that a move-on project achieves. And actually that meant that it was a bit of a Cinderella service, because actually people found it difficult to express what outcomes they achieved, in particular local authorities who we were asking about their RRO, of course. So their solution, and this goes some way towards the next step, was that they thought that these services ought to be better advertised, so both within the local authority, but also externally within to talks and presentations to community groups and in hospitals. There should be a better links to housing options teams, better partnerships across the board, and I'm certain that Michael will echo this, which is that actually it takes an awful lot of people to make a successful move across a whole range of professionals, both private sector professionals and public sector professionals, and it should be better monitored in providing better acknowledgement of outcomes, acknowledging the time that it takes for providers to do different levels of support, because I think it's not all horses for the same course, is it? These people will need different support. Some people will be able to move, will just need to be given the choice and they'll be able to move themselves. Other people will need to have their hand held through the entire system. So, and then lastly, the system for recording that can calculate the cost effectiveness of cases, and that's the call that Kevin made, of course, and who benefits. I have been thinking about this, and it's funny that Kevin has just touched on it, which is that if the market fails for a significant number of the middling folk, and we could make that market move better, who would then be the natural funder of those services? We talked to local authorities, and as I said, 181 have policies that should, in theory, enable them to pay for it. But they all said we do very, very few of them. So although the money is there, it isn't being used. Although the policy is there, it isn't being used. So, and then I wondered whether it was the local authority who benefited, or was, as Kevin said, there was a whole market of developers and commissioners of extra care schemes and housing for later life, with or without support, that I was actually benefiting. And I think that something like the system that EEC has around what is available locally in terms of residential care will have to be invented and paid for by the people providing housing with support in local in local areas. Because if 50% nearly of successful moves happen to social housing, then social housing will need to be a funding partner in this process, I think. So that's where we've got to. So having got to that point, I now need to start bending people's ears and saying, give me your money, so which is not going to be the easiest conversation in most cases. But we will do that. So I want to first of all make you aware that there is the Housing Lin is doing a happy hour on moving on. There's the slide on the 2nd of November between 4 and 5. It's another dreaded webinar, I'm afraid. I will be there too, and I will be challenging people like ARCO and and Housing 21 to say, well, actually, guys, there's a job on. If we don't get this done, because the importance is independent advice. What you can't be seen to do is to funnel people in to your own web and say, well, actually, thank you very much. We'll take your money and here's a finder's fee. You have to get independent advice in the same way that EAC ensures there's independent advice available for people entering residential care. I think that independent advice will need to be paid for by a housing sector. We're looking at models on how to do that. It's not going to be easy, but I think that by then we can stitch up the people who provide the service with, or we can join the people who provide the service, like Kevin, with the people who have the funding, capital funding available to facilitate actual moves, with the people who build the houses of our future, for our future, and actually stand to gain the most. And at that point, we will actually close a bit of the gap in that currently exists in the market. That's the vision of it. Not sure how far we'll get, but that's where we're going with this. So having pulled that all together, is there any questions? I haven't had an eye on the chat, so I'll try and catch up because there's lots going in, I can tell. Oh, it's really interesting, Callie. Yes, there is still a feeling of giving in by moving, but actually, as Michael said, I think people are happier if a move is successful, and particularly if that move is with the grain of their aspirations. I think that actually people are happier having moved rather than sticking with a house that actually no longer works for them. I might be wrong, Michael. What do you think? You've moved more people than I have.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think if we could sort of put together videos like we showed earlier, that if the success, I haven't come across anyone that's regretted moving. So it is a big step. It's a big step in whether you're 20, whether you're 80. It's a massive step in life. And if someone's been in the family home for however many years, it is a bigger step. But I would sort of think, it's much better to try and live somewhere more comfortably and safer than risking you falling down the stairs that you've gone up and down for 50 years and then ending up, sadly, some of these situations are taken away from the person then because they just cannot go back to their, and it's, it really is trying to prevent that, intervene, and yeah.
I think what Callie is also alluding to is actually the inertia in us as professionals. I've spent my life trying to ensure that people stay safe and comfortable in their own home, and actually the moving on is kind of a defeat of that object. But actually, we're now to the point where actually you have to, first of all, be real about what people's chances are in that home, and secondly, actually, there's enough people who do want to move and just need a helping hand. So I know exactly what she means. If we're moving on, Grant, you're gonna. So I hope I asked the question from Sharon that where if you use a move on grant and if there's another one available, it all depends on your local discretion how much you can then use for each of the grants, of course, and whether that's a good use of money. And I think those are local decisions rather than national decisions. So Helen, rural area, people refuse to consider move as they want to stay in their own village. So I think that's a really good point. So the extent to which there has to be the right housing in the right place is a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge in a city which is diverse and has many different communities where people want to stay, as one of the things that Michael found close to their GP. And actually, the extra care house might not, the extra care scheme might not rise next to the GP. I think it is more possible. Models of co-housing and models of very small developments are starting to emerge in small villages, but it is patchy. And actually, I think that's the other challenge for social housing providers, as we need more specialist housing, is where do we put it? It can't all be in the cities, I think. Don't know if you have any thoughts of that, Kevin? You live in Gloucestershire, don't you? There'll be a few people having downsized from London to the Cotswolds who now no longer whose home no longer suits them. Have you any views on that?
Sorry, could you just dropped out there? Can you just ask the question again?
I don't know what happens in you live in Gloucestershire, don't you? So do you have any views on what's the sustainability is of actually providing additional homes, appropriate homes in rural areas, or will all these services only succeed in urban areas where the choice of housing is greater?
Well, I don't think there's an absolute answer to that, but it's clearly easier in Bristol than it is in Cirencester, and Ampney Crucis, which is just outside Cirencester, it's even more difficult. So yes. It really depends on what's available. One of the questions in the chat said, does the Move On service support somebody moving from one private house to another private house? The answer to that is yes. It's just that the majority of people that we deal with end up in a scheme because of the nature of their requirements. And being an HIA, we obviously deal primarily with older and disabled people.
It's a really interesting question, because our vision for this service was always to move people from existing stock to existing stock, and within the private sector, and actually work with estate agents and solicitors to make this a process that was palatable and good for people. Which is where I have to say I have an interest in having an accessibility standard in the marketing of houses, so that people actually can start seeing how suitable a house will be in the longer term. But that's just another bee in my bonnet.
There's another comment on there, Francis, about we often have adults discharged from hospital, and that's for our particular service. Actually, that works well. That's where our housing options actually dovetails with the rest of the HIA contract, because an awful lot of what we do is hospital discharge related. And because, indeed, Michael may well have dealt with the hospital discharge case in the first place, it may end up with a clean and clear and adaptation or something. But if that's not suitable, we can then provide the housing options service as well to get them into somewhere that's more suitable for their ongoing needs.
So first of all, thank you for monitoring the chat. That's very kind. I clearly can't walk and talk at the same time. I think that's absolutely right. I've never felt comfortable with people being discharged at a hospital where the binary choice seems to be home, their own home, or residential care. And actually, a place of safety has to be created where people can regain the ability to make informed decisions. And if that means going home, making do for a little while, and then going down the road of exploring options, I think that is the better way of treating people. Yes, so I can see how that would work. I can also see how a life or a health crisis would generate the impetus to actually start thinking about this, because very often that's what first prompts people to start thinking about it. Sorry, I still haven't caught up with the chat, Kevin, if you have. I'm not sure that you have. Michael, have you discharged family, or have you helped people with families move? I certainly have.
Yeah. Oh yes, that's not a problem. We are open to help that, especially with someone with a disability or something that it's across. It really is across the board, and going back
Funnily enough, so the local authorities we've spoken to, it is particularly families with children for whom very often the projects that would, if you wanted to build an extension, would be so enormous and so costly that actually moving was easier for them. And even building something specific for them together with a housing association was easier than trying to adapt their existing home. So I was really clear that's one of the better options for families with hugely challenging needs. So yes, is the short answer. Sorry, was that Jane? So do you have so how do you promote your service? This is about giving out leaflets and inform people of their peripheral choice and outline your support offer at the point of leaving hospital. So how do you make sure that people actually are cited on your housing options service, Michael?
Well, we've got a big piece on our website, but we're also, because we work in such close liaison with the hospitals and health professionals, they're all aware of the service. And I think as the more people that get to know, hear about it through that, it's the same with the, home from hospital. If it goes a bit quiet, well then, or a lot of staff come in, it goes a bit quiet, but we're building up the service, and 2 or 3 of the housing options clients were formerly home from hospital clients, and I think there was something on the chat just now about after the 6 weeks someone comes home for 6 weeks with some package of care, and then but that's when that again, that's a difficult, because that's a traumatic time for someone. They've just come out of hospital, all they want to do is probably get home. But it may be that those seeds are then sown about when is with them. It's an individual thing with each person, but when is the best time to move? There's no rhyme or reason to it. But I just think it's not. Don't leave it too late, because that's where it all.
There's one final interesting wrinkle in the discussion, which Martin has pointed out, which is that actually people don't naturally always want to move to the same place, do they? And actually, if local housing assistance policies are going to work, who pays? It becomes a real question if that person moves from Cirencester to Bristol, from Bristol to Cirencester, and actually that does become complicated then, because which policy applies? Presumably it does the Bristol one, but would the Bristol invest in property in Cirencester? I have my doubts. So you can see how actually the local authority structure, even where the possibility exists, makes it very difficult for people then to move across boundaries. And although we assume that people will want to move to stay in their own communities where they've grown up, as I said, people also exercise lifestyle choices to move closer to family, to move closer to their preferred forms of leisure. So I think I'm going to leave it at that, and that's partly because the final 10 minutes always belongs to Paul to do DFG queries, and there are a couple on the questions and answers. Can I just thank Michael and Kevin for doing the work, both in the pilot and doing the film, and this afternoon? Really interesting. I feel that we've painted a really rounded picture of the issues around Move On. Thank you very much for this afternoon. Paul, if I can hand back to you, there are 2 questions on the DFG surgery in the question and answer session.